Good evening, everyone. We'll just give folks another minute or so to join. Looks like people are continuing to come in.
So we'll get started here in just a couple of minutes. We've got a few more people joining, and we'll get started here in just a minute.
Ryan, I had a question before we get started.
Sure.
Is is there a fixed list of stakeholders that are invited to this meeting? And I believe the mailing list is different from that of your open house, correct?
Yes. I think there's probably quite a bit of overlap, but yes, there is a list of stakeholders. We do add to it, so if there are folks that you are thinking should be on the committee, we're happy to um, have that discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, Ryan, I think we've got everybody in the waiting room.
Cool.
Do you want me to kick us off?
Yes, please. Thank you,
All right.
Julie.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We are excited to have you join our second stakeholder committee meeting for the Colorado Boulevard Bus Rapid Transit Project. If you want to go to the next slide. I think we are all Zoom experts at this point, but just really quickly on our agenda. We've got some slides. We're going to go through several slides to beginning just to make sure everybody's on the same page, but then we will stop and we will have lots of opportunity for talk. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, or when we get to the places where we're going to be, we'll stop for a minute. You can also unmute yourself and ask questions. We'd like this to be very informal and make sure that we get everybody's perspectives on things. So we're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities of the group, talk a little bit about the corridor, the definition, the endpoints. We had a pretty robust discussion last meeting about the sideway transits. We'll get into that a little bit more. Our tier 2 detailed screening and some of our bike facility considerations. So lots to cover tonight. But like I said, we'll hit some of these slides pretty quickly. Next slide, please. As I was saying, we're all pretty much Zoom experts at this point, I would think, after the pandemic. But just as a reminder, please mute yourself if you're not talking. Feel free at any point to put comments into the chat. We've got some folks watching the chat. And then when we get to our spots where we're going to ask for questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and ask a question. Next slide, please. So if we could, we would love to stop and get to know every single person, but we really want to make sure that we're focusing on taking the most efficient time possible for this. So if you could you please get on the chat and just add your name and your organization so that we know that you were here, and we can reflect that in our meeting notes as well. So if everybody could just hop on the chat and tell us who you are and what organization you're with, that would be terrific. And then I believe I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, who's going to kick us off and give us a big overview and make sure everybody's on the same page.
Thanks, Julie. Good to see everyone this evening. So we wanted to start with a quick recap of our meeting in November. So as a reminder, for the Colorado Boulevard BRT project, the stakeholder committee is meeting on a quarterly basis at this point. That may change as we move further into the project. But so this is our second meeting of the committee. So we had good participation, nearly 30 folks. And we talked about the roles and responsibilities of this committee, as well as the team and our overall overview of the project. So where it was coming from, and then where we are headed with this project. So we'll get more into that today because we have made some good progress since November. We have also done a little, I don't think we've done a lot more public engagement, but we have been doing some targeted stakeholder engagement. But we are, as we work through this pretty intensive process for the alternatives analysis, you'll start seeing more community engagement. So I did want to also highlight, we did a Menti poll, did a few of them actually, at that first stakeholder meeting. The results in regard to alignment for the BRT. So lots of folks showed support for a center running alignment. And then second was the side running alignment. And then third was the mixed flow operations for the BRT. So side running, but without uh, bus lanes. And then we talked about impacts at that first stakeholder meeting. So folks had indicated that in regard to uh, impacts to avoid, it was important to make sure there were few, if any, impacts to parks, schools, and other community destinations. And the least, sorry, it's a little small on my screen actually, so I'm apparently I might need glasses. Um, the impact that was least concerning to folks was impacts to mid-block turning movements. So so really hearing that you know, destinations and activity places in the corridor are really important, and we don't want to negatively impact those. A little less worried about operational impacts, especially with passenger vehicles. Next slide. So just as a reminder, I think we went over this at the first stakeholder meeting. The stakeholder committee is an important part in the development of the project. So the committee helps inform what we discuss at our technical working groups and at our regular project management team meetings, which include the local partners. So staff from the city and county of Denver, city of Glendale, Arapahoe County, RTD, DRCOG, CDOT, obviously. And then we report up to the project leadership team. So this is really leadership at the staff level for those agencies I just messaged, and they help us resolve design decisions that we can't really resolve in the lower three levels of the project management structure. And finally, the executive oversight committee. So this is, you know, your leadership at the top of these organizations. So Amy Ford, Shoshana Liu, you know, Deborah Johnson. Those are the types of folks that are on that committee, and so they are they're really at the level of making sure that we are moving in the right direction with this project, and that any of the decisions that are really contentious are hard to resolve at the other levels of the management structure. They're really the last word. So that's where this committee fits into the overall structure of the project. Um, and so, as I mentioned, as we move forward, you know, you're an important partner. We want to make sure that you help us with providing accurate information about the project to your organizations and your areas of communication in the community. So thank you for being here tonight. And as always, you know, you could reach out if you have questions about the project separate from these meetings. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me or anyone on the project team. Next slide. Okay, so overall BRT project line, or timeline rather. So as I previously mentioned, you know, we did the corridor plan, which we finished last year, and this is really where we developed this stakeholder committee and moved it forward into the BRT project. We held 3 meetings with that stakeholder meeting or committee, that iteration of it. And with this this new phase of the project, really focusing in on the BRT component, we will be, as I mentioned, meeting quarterly. So right now we're in the alternatives analysis and the environmental evaluation, also known as NEPA. We anticipate this phase of the project continuing through the end of next year. And then, should everything go as planned, we will start final design for the project at the end of 2026, early 2027, continuing through calendar year 2028. And we hope and plan on having the BRT under construction in calendar year 2028 and continuing through that year, the next year, and the goal being having the BRT open for service in 2030. So next slide. So I think we talked a little bit about the project extension last time. But so through our coordination with our local partners and our analysis of existing conditions, we have done some work around looking at what makes the most sense for the route for the BRT and for where stations could potentially be located. And so we looked at a lot of different pieces of data. We looked at employment density, propensity for transit, the existing Route 40 ridership, population density. We looked at some travel patterns using some openly available data, as well as land use and development trends. And where we landed with the project scope from north to south is that the BRT should run between 40th and Colorado Station. So that serves the A line running between Union Station and the airport, and continue all the way to Southmore Station. So that is just south of Hamden near I-25. This is a little bit different than what we initially had discussed with the BRT ending at the Colorado Station, which is near Evans and Colorado, just south of that part of I-25. So one of the reasons that we felt that this was an important change to make is, one, it is the current route for the number 40 bus. So that is the route that would be replaced by the BRT. And, if we didn't take this approach, then we would have had to think about either changes to the Route 40 area that it covers, or we would also have to think about potentially having the local service run in tandem with the BRT service, which could be difficult from a operations budget standpoint. So that was one of the reasons why we really felt like taking the number 40 and just truly upgrading it to a BRT was probably the most direct and best way to implement BRT service on Colorado Boulevard. We initially are also looking at a station spacing approach of about a half mile to 1/3 of a mile, depending on some of those things I talked about, like population density, land use patterns, transit propensity. And so that's pretty consistent with the approaches that have been taken for Colfax as well as Federal Boulevard. And you can see some of those preliminary station locations on the map on this screen. The important thing to know with the station locations, so these are simply proposals at this point. These will be vetted with not only you, but with the public as well. And certainly, they could be adjusted, they could change. But this was an initial analysis that we needed to do in order to then model transit ridership for the purposes of selecting an alternative. So we need to understand where the bus could be stopping in order to make an accurate projection for each of the alternatives as we move forward. And then finally, the discussion around the scope of the project also talked about the area for capital improvements. So as I mentioned, the service will run down to Hamden, but kind of similar to what's happening with the Colfax project. The BRT capital improvements won't go that far. They'll go as far south as Yale Avenue, but then simply because there isn't a lot of existing ridership or existing boardings and alightings between Yale and Southmore today. Um, we felt that given constrained budgets and ensuring that we're using the money that we're able to secure for this project most effectively, we felt that it was important to limit the capital improvements north of Yale Avenue, and then at some point south of Yale, and then over east on Hamden down to the Southmore station could potentially be a phase two at a future date. Next slide. Okay, so the timeline for the alternatives analysis in particular. So the last time we met, we were talking about concepts and the screening criteria for our tier one feasibility screening. So this is sometimes called a fatal flaw analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we've done that analysis, and I'll go over the results of it here shortly. Right now, we are just starting our tier two screening. So this is where you start to get into specifics about each of the different alternatives. So thinking about things like travel times, safety, connectivity, et cetera. So we'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. And then you can see once we start to wrap up this phase of the alternatives analysis, we will hold public meetings. So we are anticipating those for late June, early July, around there. And then starting in July, we will begin narrowing down the design of the project to what we call the preferred alternative. So with that, let's discuss the tier one feasibility screening. But before I do that, so one thing I did want to loop back on, and this was discussed at our first stakeholder meeting, was including a side transitway in that feasibility screening. So including it as one of the alternatives to be evaluated through this process. So we did go into what uh, transit, the side transitway could potentially look like for Colorado Boulevard, given that tier one analysis. Um, so going forward, and next slide, we did include that. So some of the features of the side transitway that are a little bit different, which you can see in these graphics here, is that both of the transit lanes are all on one side of the street, as opposed to, a center running BRT, which has the two lanes in the middle of the street and is typically separated by a median. Although I will say that there is a transitway alternative that it's very similar to a center running BRT where the lanes are not separated by a median. So that's maybe a distinction without a difference. But then there's also the side running BRT, which has the bus lanes curbside running with the direction of traffic. So the two lanes on either side of the street. Mixed flow, so very similar to side running BRT, except that it doesn't have the bus lanes. It has mixed flow traffic operations, meaning that the lane is shared with every other vehicle on the roadway. And then yes, as I mentioned, the side transitway is all on one side of the street or the other. So it could be on east and west or the west side. We evaluated both in our fatal flaw analysis. And so we'll go through that. Next slide. So we did some research into where the side transitway works, and I'll talk a little bit about some examples that we looked at. And what we found in this research is that typically this is a alignment that's used with light rail versus bus rapid transit. And I suspect that has a lot to do with utility costs. So extending utility and catenary, which is the electric lines over the street. Over the entire street is probably a lot more expensive than just having it on one side or the other. It also works really well on one-way streets where you don't have a lot of bi-directional turning movements. Uh, Lower speed streets, it typically tends to work well on lower speed streets. That's certainly where we saw a lot of the examples. And then finally, really urban places that don't have a lot of curb cuts or driveways. So you don't have a lot of those bi-directional turning movements across the um, the the transitway. It's really kind of a guideway that is distinct within the curb to curb area, but also not really sharing much room with other transit modes or transportation modes, I should say. So, just for context, so Colorado Boulevard uh, is a arterial today. It has two-way traffic. The speeds are a little higher than the lower speeds we saw with the examples we looked at. So 35 mile an hour posted speeds today, south of I-25, that's 40 miles an hour. There are 3 lanes per direction. So um, in general, for most of the corridor, 6-lane roadway with turn lanes, and then more like 8 lanes closer to I-25 and Evans. Um, The land uses are such in Colorado Boulevard, on Colorado Boulevard, that it's not quite as urban as the places where we saw the side transitway working really well. So whereas like in a downtown context, if you think about like, for example, the light rail line on California in downtown Denver, you know, Colorado Boulevard is a little more urban edge or suburban land use. So little more auto oriented for lack of a better way to put it. Um, and then the uh, the thing to consider too is that with that land use comes a lot of driveways and business accesses. And so this is really key to where we landed with the tier 1 evaluation of this concept. And I'll go to the next slide. So I saw Jill, you would just want to ask that. I saw our land use designations current or planned in Blueprint Denver.
Yeah, when you say it's suburban or urban edge, is that the current land use or is that the future desired land use under Blueprint Denver?
I believe it's I believe it's the Blueprint Denver future land use. Is that right, Anthony?
Yeah, it's both. That's the current land use, and it's kind of bleeding in towards more urban, but it's kind of in the middle there. But yeah, we looked at Blueprint Denver as well when we were categorizing it.
Thanks. So as I
I,
mentioned, sorry,
I was
hold on.
just going to jump in. Also from Colorado and I-25 from the Colorado station down to Colorado and Yale, we just completed and have the near Southeast Denver neighborhood plan. That's in District 4, but I believe it continues. I don't actually know what the northern street would be for Colorado Boulevard. But the near Southeast Denver neighborhood plan also went through an extensive process for that zoning.
Thank you, Councilwoman. So as I mentioned, we did look at some different examples of transitways, side running transitways, as well as some center running ones as well. So certainly, as I mentioned, um, the light rail lines in Denver, in Indianapolis. The red line is a BRT that has a center running application, and then the purple line, Anthony, that's a side running one, if I recall correctly, right?
Yeah, the Indigo Red Purple Line is a side running transitway.
Okay, maybe I'm
Slower
thinking of
speed, one-way traffic though.
okay, I'm thinking maybe of where the red deviates then. The Valley Metro in Phoenix has the Valley Metro light rail, which certainly runs on the side of the street. Um, and I think that runs between the airport. I think it's actually Tucson and downtown. The Miami, the South Dade Transitway. That was another example we looked at. The busways in Pittsburgh. These ones are interesting because those are actually um, they are side running, I believe, for the downtown portion, but then actually go into their own separate roadway completely and have tunnels and things. So very, very different in that regard. And then in Canada and Ottawa, the Ottawa Transitway, which is a mouthful. So I would say that in general, these lines all tended to have very different land uses than Colorado Boulevard. There wasn't really a similar corridor where we were able to find a good example of the side transitway working well. So just not to say that it doesn't exist, but we were unable to find a case that would be a good guide for how to think about this on Colorado Boulevard. Next slide. Any questions? I know we had Jill's. Does anyone else have any question?
About the transitway or any of the contexts that we've set up, because we're going to dive into some of our initial tiering criteria next. What other questions do we have?
Are there more in the chat, Julie?
No.
Okay.
I saw Jill's, so definitely feel free to put your comments in the chat and questions, or raise your hand, or just unmute. We want to make sure that we're hearing from you, but I don't see anything right now.
Let's move forward. And if anyone thinks of anything, please pop it in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions on the fly. So, okay, want to jump into the tier one feasibility screening. So as I mentioned, this was really a more of a fatal flaw analysis. So what we were really considering was two major things here: full property acquisition and major infrastructure impacts. So on the full property acquisition, really looking at this from impacts that would result in needing to acquire the full property for commercial and residential, which are a little bit different. So we considered a full property acquisition for commercial properties to be impacts that would either need or require the project to take a physical building, or it would result in impacts to the operations that could potentially close the business. So that was what we considered a full property acquisition on the commercial side. On the residential side, we considered impacts that would come within 10 feet of a structure of a house, or would end up leaving less than 20 feet of a driveway. So in those situations, we felt that the project would need to acquire that property, which would be a pretty impactful thing to do. And so any of the alternatives that went that far or beyond were eliminated on that piece. On the major infrastructure impacts piece, so we considered where alternatives would require new bridges, the relocation of billboards, and the reason why we included that is because that can be a very costly thing to do for a project because of the revenue associated with billboards. Construction of new large culverts, new structure walls, or the either addition or moving of major utilities. So those we would consider to be major infrastructure impacts that are not something that we want to include in this project because it would cause pretty significant budget increases. The other thing that we considered was additional signalized intersections. So there are, in most cases on Colorado Boulevard, the intersections are signalized. There are some that are not. So if the alternative required adding signalized intersections, that was a impact that we deemed unacceptable as well. Next slide.
Ryan, we did a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Joel was asking, without major capital improvements on the southern extension to the east, will you still reevaluate stop spacing to be the same rapid spacing or the rest of the corridor, or will this be more of a slower section of the route?
So I believe that RTD's system optimization plan has actually already done that. So I think we would probably start there, but certainly have that discussion through our community engagement and at our public meetings. But I think, for example, on Colorado, between Yale and Hamden, there are 3 stop pairs in the system optimization plan that are proposed. So, but yes, I think that that's certainly something that would be discussed.
Thank you. Got a comment from Jill, not loving the planning our future transit system around the billboards. And then we have a question from Susan regarding Colorado Boulevard, especially south of Cherry Creek South Drive. Are there plans to rezone around South Colorado? And if so, to how high?
I do not know the answer to that question. I think Mai from Denver is on the call. I don't know if she knows it, but that's certainly something that we could follow up on. Mai, do you have any idea?
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. So it's regarding South Colorado Boulevard, especially south of Cherry Creek Drive, Cherry Creek South Drive. Are there any plans to rezone along South Colorado? And if so, to how high?
I don't believe there are active community plans in that area. We could take a look at the current blueprint Denver and see what the zoning calls for and get back to you.
We'll follow up with Brian. We can put that in the meeting notes that we send out. And I missed, we did have a compliment from Councilwoman Romero. Just wanted to say thank you for taking all the way down to Southmore. I think that's all our questions for now. You want to
Okay.
It's Paul Cashman. There are no current plans for rezoning along South Colorado Boulevard.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Councilman. Okay, so next slide. So discussing all of those or those major areas for the fatal flaw analysis, the things that we ruled out are adding new lanes to Colorado Boulevard. So this would be, as I mentioned, there are in most cases 3 lanes in each direction and a turn lane at intersections. This would be adding additional lanes either in the middle or on the sides of the street to accommodate BRT. So no new lanes. We also ruled out the side transitway, and the reason that we did this for both sides was the property acquisition piece of those 2 criteria that I just discussed. So the side transitway would require that we closed a significant amount of driveways because of the bidirectional impacts that would exist from the movements of vehicles across the transitway. And so we felt that that would either require a pretty significant amount of construction, either for accesses that were off Colorado Boulevard that don't exist today, or in some cases, as I mentioned, the signalized intersections that don't exist today would need to be signalized. So basically, because of the business impacts we see with the side transitway, we didn't think that Colorado Boulevard in particular would work well for this concept. But I'll talk a little bit more about the other pieces of the components in the side transitway, because I know that there was a lot of interest with the bike component to that concept as well. And I think that there's still room within what moves forward in the analysis to talk about bike infrastructure. So what does move forward is converting existing lanes in the corridor to bus lanes, either in the middle of the street like Colfax or on the side of the street like Federal Boulevard. So that will move forward into tier 2. Next slide. And so the picture on the right is the same. The difference between the two versions of converting lanes is doing curb work versus not doing curb work. And so there's drainage impacts with that. So that'll get addressed further in the analysis, but suffice it to say the center running BRT as well as side running BRT and bus lanes moves forward. And then mixed flow also moves forward. So that's where the bus will share lanes with vehicles. Next slide. So this slide basically summarizes what I just said, but basically expanding Colorado Boulevard to add bus lanes would require property acquisitions that just are unacceptable to the community and unacceptable to CDOT. The impacts to the major infrastructure would be significant if we were to add lanes, because we'd have to build new bridges and new retaining walls and move billboards with the big poles that they're on. So those will not move forward. The side transit way, as I mentioned, requires property acquisitions because of the closure of driveways. It also requires new signalized intersections at every side street that doesn't have a signal today. And so that is a significant issue as well. But moving forward, so converting one existing lane in each direction, either on the side or in the middle, will move forward. And as I mentioned, the adjustment of curb lines versus keeping the existing ones is a little more down the line, but the center and side running alignments move forward, as well as the mixed flow operations. Next slide. So for tier 2, as I mentioned, we are just starting this process, and there are several areas that we'll be evaluating different criteria for the ones that move forward. So center, side, and mixed flow. So the travel time of the corridor, both for the bus and for general travel times. Traffic operations. So, this is looking at intersection delays, things like that. Right-of-way impacts. So this is at a very high level. Obviously, we're not doing survey at this point because we don't have, you don't really want to do that until you have an alternative selected, but we are looking at a very high level, what do we think right-of-way impacts would be and what the scale of them would be. And so we'll have some projections of what that could potentially cost as well. Corridor safety is a thing that we'll be looking at for all users. So transit users, bikes, peds, as well as drivers. Environmental considerations. So this will include both benefits and impacts. So again, very high level because we're not quite going in as far as NEPA yet. Potential ridership. So we'll look at the no build, so existing ridership, and then what each of the alternatives does to improve ridership, and cost, and finally multimodal connectivity. So making sure that we're considering how to connect best to each of the alternatives and what do we think that will do for the overall network. Next slide.
Ryan, we got a couple of questions. Joel is
Yes.
asking, we're looking at different segments, right? So it's just not a one size fits all. We're looking at different segments and we could have different options for different segments. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so what I'll say is when we get through tier two, the goal is to really develop 2 to 4 different corridor alternatives that could potentially be a mix of different alignments or different operations. And so then we'll evaluate at a corridor level what those look like against each other. And the goal would be to land on one eventually.
And then we have a question from Jill. Can environmental considerations include opportunities to reduce noise pollution?
I think we can consider that. Loretta, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that environmental considerations absolutely will be considered once we have a preferred and selection of the preferred, and we move into the kind of real detailed environmental analysis. At this point, and what's entailed with that is going through and really getting a baseline of noise, and then we add like if a BRT is added to the road, and on top of that, what traffic would be in the future. But then we start to look at what that difference is of like, what's that noise today? And then if we do the project, what does that noise become? But really that analysis comes during the NEPA phase and after we have an idea of what the BRT will look like. I mean, it's kind of at a very high level, just based on noise. Depending on where your travel lane is, has a lot of vehicles. And so kind of, if those lanes get closer to homes on the outside, their noise will likely increase. If it just becomes like a bus lane and then traffic is then dispersed, noise can kind of change from there. But as far as the screening at this point, we're not anticipating putting noise into it just because that kind of real detailed where you can actually get information on, what's going to happen to noise really is going to come after we have a preferred and we get into the environmental NEPA process.
I think where you're going with that, Jill, is are you thinking that one alignment versus another might have like quality of life impacts in regard to noise? Like, one alternative might be louder for neighborhoods versus another.
Yeah, exactly. Just like we were talking in the Federal
Mhm.
Boulevard BRT meeting the other day, I think it would be really great to include noise at this point because I think that's a big difference between having dedicated lanes or not.
Mhm.
That we've seen in other corridors where you take away a general purpose travel lane, the noise goes down significantly. And I think it would be great to be able to consider that in terms of the pros and cons of dedicated lanes versus mixed traffic for the bus.
Yeah,
Let's
let
talk
us
about it.
let's
Yeah.
talk about that, and we'll reach back and touch base, Jill.
Yep.
We've got Stuart has his hand raised, and then I've got another comment in the chat as well. Stuart?
Yeah, building off of Joel's previous comment about segments being different,
Mhm.
I see you're carrying forward the mixed lanes,
Mhm.
mixed traffic. When you really look at that for the whole corridor, it's not much more than just adding greater frequency to the 40 and reducing the number of stops. But if there are segments where it makes sense for it to go with mixed traffic, I can understand that. But as a complete
Mhm.
option, it's really not anything better than just increasing frequency. And we can do that like right now if we had money.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that we're really, the analysis could lead to potentially there being like a one solution for the entire corridor, but just given the way that how different the corridor is north to south, I don't really anticipate that being the case. I could be wrong, but yeah, I mean, we really are like taking that segment by segment approach and then having this be a data-driven process. So I expect that you probably will see mixed flow show up in certain parts of the corridor versus others more frequently, but yeah, more to come on that.
Thank you, Stuart. Joel had a question. What do Denver's Complete Streets design guidelines ideally call for in terms of target speeds? Is it really 40 miles per hour within the city? Not asking about current posted speeds, but the design guidelines intentions.
Yeah, I would say generally it's a range. So and I think, to that point about the corridor being very different north to south, the um the street types will probably, I could imagine, would be different north to south as well. Like it might be pretty different north of Alameda versus south of Alameda, and then between Alameda and 25 might be very different than south of 25. Um, so, but I will say, we are generally speaking looking at using a design speed that meets our goals for reducing speeding, which is the approach we've taken on Federal Boulevard. And so, we're still working through that process, but we are very much thinking about using the design speeds to help address problems with speeding on streets like Colorado Boulevard.
Couple other questions, definitely some comments in the chat. There's a lot of support for going back and looking at that noise and potentially factoring that into our tier 2 analysis. Ellen is asking about just the future funding, given some of the uncertainties at the federal level right now. If you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, what I would say on that point is we are really early in the process, so we don't have a good sense of how much this project will cost yet. Depending on what the alternative looks like, the range could be pretty big. Um, However, I will say we do have a significant commitment uh, from the state of Colorado, from CDOT in our 10-year plan. And so that money, that line item is $170 million. That $170 million is going to be split basically between Federal Boulevard and Colorado Boulevard. I don't I don't know what will be allocated toward what yet, but that some level of that funding is going to be going into the project, and probably a pretty significant amount of it. So what I can say is that, we will certainly, we have a big financial commitment in the project. We're going to work to leverage other funding with that money in order um, to get the best BRT that we can. And I don't know particularly what that will look like yet. Certainly other BRT projects have, and Federal Boulevard has been working to secure funding from the Federal Transit Administration. Uh, that may be an option for this project as well. I think we're kind of waiting to see what happens in the next several months with federal funding, particularly from the Federal Transit Administration. But that could be a potential option. There are other options as well, but the funding plan will be more detailed once we have a sense of what the project costs.
Thank you. Couple more, there's a couple of comments here about pedestrian improvements. That if we're looking at the center option, what are we going to do to make sure that people have the flexibility to move along the sidewalks? A lot of about sidewalk access and to the stops, because it's kind of virtually non-existent right now in some of the areas. You want to talk a little bit about that and how it flows into the project?
Yeah, and maybe I think on the next one or two slides, we kind of have some information that coincides with that pretty well. Yeah, so at the last meeting, we talked about bikeways, both connecting to and on Colorado Boulevard. And so I think certainly with considering bike facilities, we are also considering better pedestrian facilities. And, it could be that the project lands on multi-use paths, which do exist in some parts of the corridor, maybe in other parts of the corridor it makes sense. Maybe um, bike lanes that are separate from the sidewalks, most likely behind the curb, if I'm going to be honest, would make sense on Colorado Boulevard. So what we're doing really is taking a look at where we anticipate stations could go, looking at the existing conditions, and really trying to identify where the gaps and where the areas for improvement exist. And so I think the next slide shows that for bikes. If you can go to the next slide. Yes. So you can see in the green, we've done some work using existing data sources to really identify where bike infrastructure has already been identified as like a high priority, but then where we think there's a lot of potential for additional bike infrastructure. And not to say that the areas that aren't highlighted on this map don't matter. I mean, I think they certainly do matter, and we'll be looking at those as well. But these are kind of some focal areas that I think we're going to be considering. And I would say that we'll be doing the same thing for pedestrian improvements as well. Looking at intersections in particular, we're going to be wanting to make sure that, particularly where stations are located, that the crossings are improved and optimized for folks who are accessing the BRT either in the middle of the street or at the sides of the street. And so we'll think more about what that looks like on an intersection by intersection basis once we have the alternative selected. But certainly things like, considering crossing improvements, signal timing, other things like curb extensions where they make sense. Those are things that we'll be considering.
And a couple other additional questions just to close the loop. Joel and
Mhm.
Jill, a comment about Joel's talking about this as a relative to speed, that he doesn't see the recommended speed range higher than 35 miles per hour, and we expect that the tested designs and final outcome would be designed to reinforce the intended target range rather than leave the status quo.
Yeah, so we certainly are working with Denver's Complete Streets Guidelines as well as CDOT's roadway design manual to ensure that the project is meeting those guidelines and advancing those standards. And there's quite a bit of overlap to be honest. I mean, like CDOT's roadway design guidelines also have ranges. So I think we're all on the same page in regard to making sure that we can think about how this corridor operates and today and will operate safely in the future. And we recognize that speeding is a huge problem on our arterials in the city. And as I mentioned, with our design, we will be looking at trying to reduce the speeding problem.
Excellent. And then we have one last outstanding question from Paul. If the existing 1,600 cars each hour in each direction is compressed to 2 lanes, how will gridlock be addressed?
Well, that's a good question. So I would say, we're going through a very thorough traffic analysis with each of the alternatives that we move out of the tier 2. And so with that traffic analysis, we'll be looking at potential diversion. So where would cars go if we made changes to the lane allocations on Colorado Boulevard, or changes to the signal progression and operations. So we're going through a pretty significant traffic analysis. Once we start evaluating corridor level alternatives, we'll have a good sense of what could happen with those alternatives. And then, I think the other piece of that is that, we do anticipate that some trips will be shifted from passenger vehicle to transit. So, those two things really are how we will evaluate what that particular impact could be.
Great. We're caught up on comment or questions for now.
Okay. Next slide. All right. I think I kind of covered the bike piece a little quickly, just kind of within the context of that question. Did anyone have any follow-up questions about the bike piece specifically? I don't want to shortchange it.
We got a yay bikes.
Yes.
I have a comment. I was just typing it in. But, I would certainly welcome bike facilities on Colorado, but our issue is more about the east-west connections
Mm,
from activity centers that are going to be just off of Colorado. And one great example is, we've talked about the multimodal center at Burns Park, but if we have micromobility options to get people all the way over to the shopping mall or to other places, it really isn't a safe way to do it currently. And there's lots of places along there. Even the new development in Glendale, the 4 Mile District, is going to be a big activity center, but it's just pushed back off of Colorado.
yeah. Thanks, Stuart. We will be looking at, as I mentioned, connections to the line from the side streets. I think we're working really closely with Dottie on that. So certainly, yeah, we agree that the connections are really important.
We have a question from Councilman Cashman. As
Yes.
currently scheduled, will we have time to learn from the successes or failures on the Colorado BRT project before we launch into building the final recommendations for this project? For Colfax BRT, I apologize, before we start building.
Yes, we will. Yes. So I believe feel free to correct me. I believe that the Colfax BRT is scheduled to be complete by early 2027. Is that right, Mai? Is the timeline still on schedule?
Yeah, it's still on schedule.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we don't anticipate at the earliest being in construction on Colorado Boulevard until 2028. So I think that's going to give us certainly the design process from Colfax as well as from Federal Boulevard is giving us a lot of good lessons learned that we can bring to this project. But with the actual construction phase, I think, we've been getting the question on the Federal Boulevard BRT project. What are we learning about what's going on with the Colfax construction for Federal Boulevard? And we're working closely with Dottie on, taking what goes well on Colfax BRT as well as what could be improved and bringing that to bear on this project as well as the other one.
Terrific. And then we've got a question from Lou or a comment. The city already invested in the Garfield Bikeway, so that should be the main north-south bikeway for that area. And I think that's pretty close to Colorado. And then Mike from Hilltop is also, he's supporting that. Ditto Stewart's view. The bike consideration needs to look at origins and destinations east and west of Colorado. And I'll add that the analysis needs to look at existing north-south routes that parallel Colorado.
Yeah, those are good comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Joel's agreeing people on bikes need to be able to access the same major destinations along the corridor as people in cars.
Agreed. And also, I think we may have talked about it in the first stakeholder committee meeting, but with the BRTs, we are wanting the BRT vehicles, the buses, to accommodate onboard bikes. So really having more of that rail experience, similar to taking your bike on the A line or one of the light rail lines. We want to make sure that you don't, if you are making a multimodal trip, you're not having to leave your bike somewhere if you don't feel comfortable doing that.
Well, we're running close on time. Do you want to do the last couple slides and then we can open it up one last time for questions?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So our next stakeholder committee meeting will be this summer. So on that quarterly cadence, as I mentioned. So we have a few milestones coming up, as I mentioned. In May, we will have developed those 2 to 4 corridor level alternatives, and then we'll present those in June at our second public open house. Our first one was in September of last year. And so this is where we'll really be talking to the public on the considerations for those different alternatives. So from there, we'll have a another check-in with you, and we'll go over what we heard from the public, and then ask you for your feedback and guidance as well. Following all that feedback, we'll work to select a preferred alternative, and then we will have another touch point with the public for that preferred alternative. So specifically, is this the right design for BRT on Colorado Boulevard before we move more into design and then really into the meat of the environmental review process.
Well, and I have to apologize to Joel. The way I presented his last comment, I think might have misconstrued it. He said he was not necessarily expressing agreement. His point was 3 blocks away in a low scale residential area is not a replacement for biking to the corridor's destinations. And Jill included bikes deserve multiple route options, just like cars have multiple. So I probably presented that incorrectly. I apologize, Joel.
Well, those are good comments. Thank you. Next one. Okay, so that's our last slide. Any last questions? I know we're a little bit over time, but happy to stay on and answer any more questions if you have them.
Do you have a date for the open house, the next open house?
We're still working on scheduling it, but we should have it here shortly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we will be sending out meeting notes for this. We will also be posting this on the website so that anybody that couldn't attend can participate as well. And don't forget, we have the hotline. We always want to hear from you.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Good meeting.
Will you be sending out the slide deck?
Absolutely. The slide deck and the meeting notes. We'll get those out next week.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. This was a great discussion.
Oh, I saw a question in the chat real quick. We are, and I think I mentioned this in an email earlier, we are open to meeting
Absolutely.
and presenting at regular RNO meetings, as well as other organizational meetings. So if you have a bid meeting or any kind of organizational meeting, we're happy to come and talk.
So yeah, feel free to reach out to us through the hotline or the email or to Ryan directly, and we'll absolutely get that scheduled. All right. I think that's a wrap.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.